Okay, in this video, since in our ethics class we're going to be talking about issues that pertain mostly to human beings, I mean, someday I would love to do an animal ethics or a plant ethics, how animals and plants should behave, but for now we're going to stick into humans. And in order to do that, being a philosopher, it's really important that we're able to define what is a human being. Now, I'm not talking about a human body. I mean, that would be quite simple because we could simply use DNA, we could compare it to the genome of all the other known species we have, and it would be quite easy to say that is a human body, that is a sequoia body, that is a pit bull body, that's a goldfish body based on the DNA. But that's not what I'm asking, because you could have a human body, but if the human being is gone, I would call that human body a corpse. Okay, it's a vessel or vehicle, but the body has, the being has departed. Now, if you're a naturalist materialist, the body and the being are one, right? Because there is no belief in the soul or the spirit or any non-material part of a human being. For a naturalist materialist, you have a brain, you don't have a mind. You have a body, you don't have a soul. But being a theist, coming from a Christian religious perspective, we believe we have both a physical material body, which comes into space and time, and then, at the point of conception, we grow. When our spirit departs, our body returns to the elements from which it came. But from a theistic perspective, we also believe there's a non-material part of man. And that is really what I'm looking for. That is the being piece. What is that being that inhabits a human body, but continues or is separate in some ways from that physical material body? Coming from a Christian perspective, part of the clue I like to give my students is think about in Genesis, where God talks about male and female created he them, in his image created he them. And so we are the only aspect of creation that is spoken of in terms of being in the image of God. No plant, no animal, no bird, no fish, no angel is given that attribute. And so what I would ask you to think about is, what is it that God and man, or God and humans, share in common that other beings do not share? And as you can imagine, this is quite a difficult conversation to have or thing to think about. This is something I think about almost every day of my life. It's one of my favorite philosophical questions. What is a human being? And even though I have been doing this over 30 years, I have a very short list. And the reason it's short is because most of the things I can think of, I realize animals can do that, or angelic beings can do that. So what is it unique about God and man from other things? That's what I'm looking for. And let me give you some examples. A lot of my students will say, well, we can reason. In fact, that was Aristotle's definition of a human being. We're the rational animal. And I would say to Aristotle, even though I respect his intellect mightily, you need to spend more time around animals. Animals have incredible intellect and reason. They can problem solve. They have memory. They make choices. They sort things out. It's not like they're just these mindless, driven by their appetites, right? So I don't think saying reason is enough. And then think of the problem on the other end. Do you have to have a certain level of reason to be considered a human? Are children not human until a certain point of development? Aristotle actually didn't believe so. He believed there was a certain level of, I think, and even Thomas Aquinas, a Christian theologian, thought you didn't become a human being until the quickening. And I believe that in medieval terms, that was the first time a woman could feel a child in her womb. That was called the quickening. And they believe that's when the organic material of human life inside the woman was given a spirit by God, and that's what initiated the human being part of the human. Others believe it happens at birth, when you get breath, others at conception. I personally believe, because I'm an idealist, a philosophical idealist, we become beings, living beings, the moment God first thought of us. And do you guys know when God first thought of us? If anyone?
Always.
Thank you, Justin. Which means you've always existed, at least in the mind of God. And to me, that means more than having a physical body or physical frame. As long as God is thinking of me and aware of me, I exist. And since God knows all things and can't learn new things, it means, at least philosophically, theoretically, I've always existed in the mind of God. And that's kind of an interesting concept to think about. So what are these unique things pertaining to God and man? And once again, I'm going to go to the Genesis account. And I know if you're like a secular humanist or atheist agnostic listening to this, you're probably just smacking your head and saying, these crazy religious fanatics. But I think it's super interesting from a worldview perspective piece. So in Genesis, it said, man was formed from the dust of the ground, and God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living being. So there's the first clue, right? No other part of creation were talked about God directly breathing into them except for man. And then woman, from the Genesis account, was taken from the rib of man. So she was from man. Man was from the dirt. That was his body, but what made him a living being or a living soul was the very breath of God. So how cool is that? And meditate on that a little bit. When you breathe, think about the reason you're able to breathe is because of the very breath of God within you. And I think that's quite fascinating. Then I think if we turn to what did God task human beings to do in the garden? What were they told to do? And this is quite interesting. He asked Adam to name the animals. In naming the animals, it meant Adam would be able to categorize, he'd be able to distinguish differences, and he would have to have creativity to come up with names to describe in a language the different beasts of the field, birds of the air, creepy things, etc. And so I believe creativity is one of those things unique to human beings. Now, some of you might be saying, what are you talking about? I've seen like elephants that can paint, and have you seen a spider web or a swallow's nest? Yes, I'm aware of all of these things. But it's very rote, right? It's being trained. It's not this idea of taking an idea or concept and then innovating and building and bringing something new into the world. And I don't mean new as in the sense that we're creating something from nothing, but humans have the ability to take pre-existing things and combine them in new and novel ways into the universe. And I think that is part of our being made in the image of God. God is the ultimate creator, and we are like these sub-creators, limited, of course, but under God's creation, we are like sub-creators or co-creators that build off of the work of his hands. Things like a swallow or a spider, even though it's incredible architecture and design, you will just see the same pattern in that species year after year, decade after decade, millennia after millennia, ever since we've been observing those. If humans were swallows or spiders, you would have Frank Lloyd Wright swallow nest, you would have Victorian swallow nest, you would have modern, you would have all these different creative things. Bowerbirds, they make incredibly interesting, actually weaving together twigs to make a bower in the woods to entice their mates. And even though each bower is different, it's all sort of the same design. You don't have Gothic bowerbirds, you don't have postmodern bowerbirds. They're all continuing in. So creativity, organization, seeing differences. Another thing we do as humans is think about our concepts of good and evil, right? Now you can say, well, we weren't created with that. We stole that according to the Genesis account. But even in the Genesis account, before Eve ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it said she saw the fruit, that it was pleasant to the eyes and good for food. So she already had some sort of concept of good. Now, I don't know that that was moral goodness, but it was probably at least like a preference. Like this looks desirable, this looks like it will bring pleasure instead of pain or suffering. Another thing unique about human beings, I think, is we're self-reflective. We're introspective and analytical. And what I mean by this is, say your car breaks down, or say you're out hiking and you twist your ankle, or you might get in an accident or have to have a surgery or something. We rarely just take things for how they are. We're trying to look for explanations, like cause and effect, like, why did this happen to me? And I don't know that animals or angels do that. I think, now it would be impossible to tell unless I could actually get into a bat's head or a dog's head or a cat's head, which I'm not able to do. But it seems like animals they're kind of zen about the whole thing, right? They're just living in the moment, taking things as they come. Now you might say, well, they plan for the future, Blackburn. They store up things. But once again, I think that's more at an instinctual level. I don't think they're thinking in their heads, you know what? We got a little low on acorns last winter. I think we might want to double up this year. I don't think there's that kind of introspective thinking about cause and effect and how things happen. I think that's a unique human condition. I'm running out of time, so if you want to get the full list, you'll have to watch the hour video, but I want to leave with this one because I think it's super fascinating, and it's laughter. I think laughter is a unique human trait that we only see in God and man. There's no record of angels laughing. I don't know any accounts of animals laughing, but humans and God are both, at least the scriptures record God laughing, and we see humans laughing all the time. In fact, whenever I hear a baby laugh... All right, so I was just finishing up before I got cut off on laughter. Laughter is like a pain release for deep emotion. It can also be done with tears. I do believe some animals do cry. I have seen especially some of the greater apes or primates. With Jane Goodall, I remember one clip where she encountered this captive chimpanzee baby, and she actually studied and learned the different calls and chirps and sounds chimp mothers make to chimp babies. And when she encountered this captive chimp, she started to communicate, and the baby chimp actually had like water tears, emotional tears in its eyes. And I was thinking, holy cow, so much for my only humans cry. And I don't mean like a horse, if it gets poked in the eye, or it's gonna weep, but I'm talking like an emotional release coming out through tears. So there are a few exceptions, but I would say for the most part, crying, like emotional crying, and then definitely laughter, those are unique human traits. Does anyone know the context of God laughing in the Bible? It's not joyful, I can tell you that. Every time I see laughter in the Bible associated with God, it's always associated with the destruction of the wicked. And I'm assuming that brings God pain because he's destroying the works of his hand. And I think at one level, he certainly doesn't want to do that. He wants all creation to come to repentance. But on the other, it says God will laugh them to scorn, those who have rebelled against him or those who rise up against him. And so when we see the laughter of God in the Bible, it's usually associated with pain or suffering, not joy or celebration. Okay. So what is a human being? It's almost impossible it is impossible to define, even in a shared worldview. Even if we're all theists and believe we have a body and a soul, or a body and a soul and a spirit, it's so hard to come to consensus, let alone if we include other worldviews, like a pantheist or a naturalist who just sees humans as our DNA, our genome. And so I think it's important to think about, and I really raise the question more for you to see the difficulty than me hoping to solve it. And you can see why so many of these ethical questions are going to be difficult, like abortion, right? If you really believe someone becomes a human being at conception, you're going to have a very different view than if you just believe humans are made up of physical material parts, but there's no being inside that human. It's also going to affect euthanasia or capital punishment or these other life and death issues we may deal with in ethics, depending on how you define a human. Can you stop being a human being? If you become psychotic or a sociopath or something like that, or if you get dementia, is there a certain level where we say that's not a human anymore? It's just a ball of suffering flesh, and we need to euthanize it out of mercy or compassion. And so I don't pretend to have an answer for you, but that's kind of my short list. We're made in the image of God. We have the breath of God within us. We have the ability to distinguish, differentiate, make value judgments. We're introspective. We look at why things happened. We're like the only species I know of that when bad things happen to us, we try to figure out, was it our fault? Are we being punished for something? Or if good things happen, are we being rewarded? And then the emotional releases of physical emotional weeping and of laughter.